Welcome to MSL Talk with Tom Caravela, a podcast specifically designed for MSLs and all things field medical. Hey guys, welcome to the podcast. My guests today are Christina Wright, Brad Atkinson, and Brian Wilson. And we talk about the important role that medical affairs and MSLs can play in diversity in clinical trials. Awesome conversation. I learned a lot. I hope you guys enjoy it. Don't forget to follow us on YouTube and Instagram and LinkedIn, and check us out on Clubhouse Live. Thanks for joining us. Hey guys, thanks for joining me. Welcome to the podcast.
Hey, Tom, thanks for having us.
Yeah, I'm really excited. Really, this is something we've been planning for a while. It's a very, very important topic. I want to thank Christina for bringing it to me and for bringing the group together. I feel like I have an all-star team of folks to talk to, and I can't wait to get into it. But before we do that, let me first start with a disclosure statement and just say that the opinions that are going to be stated here from the three individuals are their own and not their company opinions. So we want to just get that out of the way. And then I'm going to have everybody introduce themselves. So Christina, why don't we start with you? Ladies first.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Thank you, Tom. Like you said, yeah, this is a long time coming, but an awesome topic. You know, this is perfect timing, and we do have an amazing group on the call today. So it's going to be a really great discussion. I'm looking forward to really learning from all of you on here. So thanks for having me. I'm Christina Wright. I am an MSL lead at TG, so I lead the Southeast MSL team in the area of multiple sclerosis. And for a very long time, I've had a special interest in diversity in clinical trials. So I am very happy to be on this call today. Thank you.
Awesome. Great. Well, thank you for that. And who's going to go next? Let's go, Brian. Why don't you go next?
Sure, Tom. So, hey, everyone. Thanks for having me on the show. It's always a pleasure to talk about important topics like this. And for those who don't know me, my name is Brian Wilson. I'm a Regional Medical Scientific Director at Merck, supporting our cardiovascular portfolio, and very passionate about D&I, which means diversity and inclusion, and really keying up these very important and relevant conversations. So thanks for having me.
Awesome. Thanks for being here, Brian. And Brad, you're up.
All right, thanks for having me, Tom. Again, very excited to have this platform to share this discussion today. So my name is Brad Atkinson. I'm one of the regional directors at AstraZeneca for our MSL Phil team in thoracic cancers. I am the regional director for the West team, so I'm very happy to be here and involved in some of our diversity and inclusion in clinical trials initiatives within AZ. And again, just happy to be here having this broad context and conversation with everybody today.
Yeah, for sure. Well, thank you guys again for joining me. And let's jump into it, because obviously we've got a lot to talk about. There's four of us, so I want to give everybody some, ample opportunity to contribute. And so as we get into this topic, I guess the first question that I have is why? Why is it important for the pharmaceutical industry, specifically medical affairs, to be involved in the diversity inclusion initiatives as it relates to clinical trials? And I think we're going to have Brad, we're going to have you kick this off.
Yeah, thanks for the question, Tom. So I think it's important, one, to recognize that historically, our clinical trial populations have not been very reflective of the target population who use the medicine. And so obviously for a variety of reasons, but most importantly for drug safety and efficacy, there can be various variations across the demographic subgroups. And so I think it's important for us as industry to make sure that our trials are as reflective of the relevant population who are affected by the disease and who are going to use the medications. For example, Minorities have historically been underrepresented in clinical trial populations. They make up about 12% of the US population, but only have been 5% of clinical trial participants, and even less for other clinical trials like cardiovascular disease and oncology clinical trials. They represent about less than 3% of the population. And we know that racial and ethnic subgroup populations are growing, and that we're having more guidance from regulatory authorities to have a more representative trial populations. There's the FDA guidance on enhancing the diversity of clinical trial populations. And then as industry, we have a social responsibility, and it's clinical trial diversity is a part of health equity and fairness, and just ensuring public trust in our medications. So we take this patient-centered approach, which means that we need to develop drugs with all patients in mind as well. So that's the broader landscape. Why medical affairs? And let us be honest, I think there's a role and an opportunity and more than enough work to share within industry, not just medical affairs, but working with our clinical development teams, our clinical operations teams, medical, commercial, marketing. I think we each all have a role into it, but why medical affairs should be at the table and be part of this conversation, I think it really, to me, it really comes down to 3 pillars. And one is our scientific expertise. And so as medical science liaisons, we're seen as the point of contact for that unbiased, credible resource for the scientific and clinical narrative of what the unmet need is, biology, mechanism of action, safety, efficacy. And we sit across from the table when we're representing our clinical trials and defining that unmet need of the KOLs, our key opinion leaders, our healthcare providers. So defining what the clinical trial design is, what the eligibility criteria are, why the sites are selected, all of that is part of what is represented in our patient characteristics. And sitting across from a healthcare provider and asking, do these demographics resemble your patient population? I think we, as MSLs, being that unbiased, credible resource, have to be able to defend that to them as well. So one is our scientific expertise. 2 is our relationships. So, you brought in Christina, Brian, myself, and I. We have relationships, and these conversations are not easy, right? Having diversity conversations and discussions are not easy. You need to have established relationships to have difficult conversations. So for us to be able to increase awareness and educate on need for diverse trials and collect those insights and bring those back internally, we need to have those relationships that sometimes have those difficult or engaging conversations.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then I was going to add just one more.
Yeah.
And the last one, Tom, is as the MSLs, we're very entrepreneurial. We're often seen as the CEOs of our territory. So we best know our territory. What is that geographical representation of the patient population? Who are those key opinion leaders? Where are opportunities to identify minority sites or minority investigators? So really understanding what barriers and challenges each site may have and being able to tailor our approach to those sites. So thanks for letting me go on that.
That's a great kickoff. No, that's a great kickoff. I mean, there's a lot to unpack in there. And I want to go back a little bit and just maybe, you mentioned some therapeutic areas and statistics. And just from the first thing you said, it's already shocking to me that the numbers are so skewed and there's a lack of representation. So I want to hear from Brian. Maybe is there anything that you can add to that? Any opinions, thoughts, statistics as it relates to the therapeutic areas? And are there certain therapeutic areas that stand out more so than others as it comes to the lack of diversity and inclusion?
So thanks for that, Tom, and thanks, Brad, for that commentary. really good job at laying the landscape. I think before we even talk about a therapeutic landscape, I think it's very important that we understand the social business aspect of why it's important to include diverse and inclusive action and strategies when we think about clinical trials. And that's because pharmaceutical companies, we're not just here to promote products, and we're simply not just here to develop new therapeutics. We're here to be of service to mankind. And one way you be of service to mankind is really by understanding what their needs are. And so at Merck, we put patients first. We believe that patients come first, and they are the cornerstone of all that we do. And so we're not doing our jobs properly if we're not keeping the patient first. So I think it's important that we understand that in industry, whether it's pharmaceutical, biotech, or et cetera, we're really in the business of understanding what the healthcare needs are of the patients that we serve. Now, to Brad's point, it is true that those that are most impacted by chronic diseases are not necessarily represented in trials that are developing therapeutic to treat those diseases. And that's why diversity in trials are so important. They're important because we have to have the right people, and they have to have a seat at the table. And if we are going to be laser focused in answering their needs, then that certainly has to be an objective that we're constantly thinking of, that's constantly on our table, and something that we're constantly trying to improve.
Great. I love it. And I feel like, so we kind of got the overview and the background to start, an opinion from Brad. We have an opinion from Brian. So now I want to hear from Christine. I want to hear your knowledge and your opinion and your thoughts on this piece too. Instead of getting real granular, I'd love to hear from you and see kind of what your overall thoughts are.
Yeah, I thank you, Tom. I really think that Brad and Brian really summed it up well as far as the why. I think the big question is, honestly, I would say the majority of people that work in large pharma biotech get that. It's just, I think it's important for us to start this conversation as to discuss the why. It's important to do that. But I think we are getting to the point where we are understanding that, because to Brad and Brian's point, we strive to be patient-centric, and we strive to do better for mankind. And we are getting those insights. We are hearing that there is this gap. So we know it. The actual real conversation is potentially the granular, like, how can we make it happen? So yes, I agree with everything Brad and Brian says. I think overall it's medical affairs in all parts of industry, but specifically medical affairs really ties in with the scientific aspect, like Brad mentioned, and we are trying to advance the science. So that aspect comes into really advancing the science. Let's provide science that actually is applicable, that our providers and clinicians can use. And then there are other pieces, being patient-centric, like who are our patients? So I absolutely agree on everything. And I do think now, because we're understanding the why, how can we do this? Like, what are the barriers? And then also let's get past to discussing what the barriers are and actually be actionable. And to Brad's point, the field medical team, we are the face, in addition to other field teams, we're the face. So having the tools and the support to be able to go out and have these conversations and bring back the insights, I think is really important. And that's why I think this conversation is so very important for us today. So.
Cool. Well, I could tell you that we're all in agreement. We know the why. And we've already, I feel like we've already covered a lot of ground, but what I want to get to is, like, what are the barriers and how do we go over them? How do we so there's got to be reasons this is happening, but there's also got to be good, tangible solutions and takeaways. So I want to make sure that as we continue to use the time that we have, we can educate people on why this is happening and what we may be able to do. So let me go back to Brad and see if he can jump in, and maybe you can help us understand why there's such a problem.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. It's kind of a loaded question because there are so many barriers and challenges to overcome. And so some of those may be sponsor or industry related, maybe not fully understanding what the needs of the patients are, what the needs of the sites are, how to participate, the ability to identify diverse investigators and diverse sites represented. It may even start before designing clinical trials, again, thinking about epidemiology and making sure when we design a clinical trial that we're thinking about epidemiology beforehand, of who the patients are that are going to be served, and making sure that we have maybe recruitment targets for the patients that we want to be served in identifying those sites to do it. There's site barriers, again, back to the lack of minority and investigators and research staff. Again, we know that most patients are treated in the community setting, but we know that most of our clinical trials tend to go to larger academic institutions, maybe larger integrated delivery networks for these. And so how can we make sure that we're getting opportunities for community sites that may serve minority populations? There's just lack of awareness of clinical trials, lack of education about what research means, and also foundationally coming to an understanding of what historical challenges that we need to overcome, some of the previous stigmas that we've placed on research in the United States. So there's a number of obstacles and barriers to overcome. And then on the patient aspect, there's practical obstacles. How do we deliver within our clinical trials, these practical obstacles that are on patients, including daycare, time away from work, reliable transportation, this lack of trust that we mentioned in pharma or research, and then health literacy, language barriers. And so I think, again, it's going to it takes a lot of work. It takes a fundamental understanding of your geography, your research sites, and aligning with the strategy of your company with the clinical development program and how we can fully execute this. So it takes a lot of cross-functional partners being involved in it, a lot of discussion and a lot of insights. And so again, I'm glad that we're here today, furthering that discussion and awareness along.
Yeah, I mean, we're definitely talking it through. And I think that as you're kind of, talking about the obstacles and the barriers, but also had some really good ideas of, maybe how to start to ways to overcome that. So I want to continue along that you mentioned education, and I feel like when we look at field medical being out there in the front lines, what more can field medical do, and how do they arm themselves with the right resources? How do they educate themselves? How do they go about those conversations? And what goals should be set out from a strategic standpoint from medical affairs organizations to try to impact some of this? And I know that that's a big question. So maybe, I don't know, Brian or Christina, whoever wants to go next, maybe we could just start talking about how to arm medical affairs, specifically MSLs, to start to have these conversations.
Sure. So I'm happy to jump in there, Tom, and I'll go back to your comment around barriers and where do these barriers come from? And I think it's incredibly important that we remember within the history of America, there has been a series of strategies and societal context put in place that was rooted in separateness. And so what does that mean? You mentioned something very important, education. So let's use medical education as an example. So many people don't know this, but prior to 1923, there were actually 7 historically Black medical schools in the United States. There were 7. And then around the early 1920s, there was a report that was commissioned which was later called the Flexner Report, which was basically an evaluation of medical schools across the United States and Canada. And so that evaluation allowed a governing body to assess the merit of medical schools, both in Canada and the US. So what were the results? So the results were dire because it not only impacted Black medical schools, but it also impacted medical schools for women. So some of the key findings from the Flexner report were rooted in separateness. So Abraham Flexner actually wrote in the report that he believed women should not have separate schools, but that they should be integrated in predominantly male schools. And then he also noted within that report that he felt that African American physicians should be limited to the practice of being sanitarians. So not actually being a part of the predominant medical practice, but being more of a maintenance role. So if you think about that for a second, you can clearly see where those barriers started much, much earlier than this conversation we're having right now. And the ramifications are deep. So after 1923, 7 of the African American schools that were open at the time, that number was decreased. And 5 of the 7 were closed. Over the years, there have been 1 more medical school that has opened up, Morehouse, and so you now have predominantly 3 Black medical schools. But it just goes to show you how the context of historical separateness, racism, and a lack of inclusiveness has led us to where we are now. So what does that mean? I think from medical affairs perspective, we have to think about how are we characterizing what an academic institution actually is? How are we characterizing what a scientific leader is or what a key opinion leader is? There are certain criteria across the industry, but we know based on the territory, based on the environment, and the social needs of that community, that can look very different from institution to institution. So we have to become very inclusive in how we're evaluating scientific leaders, how we're evaluating what's scientifically successful, and what does that look like. Again, it's going to be very different from region to region and from institution to institution, but we have to have that openness to understand it's not just about the merit of an academic institution, it's not just about the merit of a scientific leader, but it's more about the patients and the need that they're serving. And that's how you can begin to align a strategy that is more inclusive.
Wow, that's great. Thank you for that. That was an awesome overview and really insightful. And I think it sets Christina up really good too, because I feel like we're really at that point where I want to tie back in the what do we do next? I love when people get back to me after they listen to one of these episodes and say, hey, I got some really good takeaways, and I feel like I know that I need to take action and I need to do something. And so I want to make sure, and I don't want to jump ahead. I'm glad that we talked about the why and the history, and I don't want to keep jumping ahead, but I'm excited. I see that there's obviously a problem, and we know that it affects the patient and it affects everyone. So I want to hear from Christina and see what her thoughts are and on what you think we can do. What's next, or what ideas do we have that might be able to start to influence a change?
Yeah, absolutely, Tom. And, I would love to kick off, and then I love, when I'm done, if Brad and Brian, if you have anything to add. So I can start with, great segue from what Brian was saying, because I think that ties into something extremely actionable that our field medical teams can do. So when we think about field medical, obviously we know that every company, every team, there's going to be different priorities, different activities they're going to be involved in. But generally, field medical team, they do have certain things that are somewhat similar across. One of those is establishing a KOL list or a thought leader list and establishing relationships there. That goes a lot to what Brian was saying, and that, we typically may have a list that looks a certain way, but we may not be targeting someone who does research specifically in diverse patient populations, or we might. It depends. But starting there is one good place where you are, just like Brad says, you are the CEO of your territory. You can diversify that territory a little bit by identifying where are those historically Black colleges And where are the physicians there? What about those community clinics that do education at the barbershops or the churches? Like, finding out about your territory and understanding a little bit more is one actionable item that a field medical team could start really doing. And then, hey, it increase your list and increase your interactions. It helps all the way around, right? Other areas that field medical are very much involved in would be in supporting company-sponsored studies. We recommend sites potentially. I know every field medical team is different, right? So I'm just throwing out some things. When you are recommending sites, it depends on what your role can be there. You can start talking to more sites that have more diverse population. There's a possibility even when you're gathering those sites to be able to identify if there's some form or way to create a metric or where you say, okay, well, this site has this level of diversity. Field medical can be involved in that. Some other areas that field medical can be involved in is keeping up with that site. Keeping up with the PIs and the sub PIs, learning from them and providing information, learning from them and bringing back insights. There's plenty of ways to do that. And the last thing I'll say, and then I'll punt it over to Brad or Brian. And I think this is part of the conversation that's very important. The question is, we know the why, we know we need to be talking about it in the field, but how do we feel comfortable talking about this topic of the need to increase diversity in our clinical trials, whether that's valuable, or even how to express if there's a pharmaceutical company, which I know that there are quite a few that have publicly said that they want to increase diversity in clinical trials. How do you communicate that? So I think in addition to being, more cognizant of your territory and really trying to diversify that, being able to provide sites that are a little more diverse, taking that opportunity to start having those conversations with your sites, with the PIs, sub PIs, clinical coordinators, they're all in there and they're available for you to talk to, but also start having more focused activities to help your team feel comfortable having these conversations. And some of those, can be, and I can give some examples that I'm thinking of. There are many scientific articles out there that talk about increasing diversity, that talk about, certain subgroup populations and what the data looks like in them. And talking about it from a scientific perspective is what we do. We do want to understand, what does CLL look like in African-American patients? What does multiple sclerosis look like in Indigenous patients? And that is a part of the scientific conversation. So having journal clubs on articles that have actually been written by thought leaders that we have. So then we get to learn a little bit more about the interests of those thought leaders by discussing an article that they publish on a subgroup population. So that just causes us to feel comfortable having this conversation and also encourage us to get insights from our thought leaders on these topics. So I know that I talked a lot. And I know that Brad and Brian have more to add to that. But that's all I'll add.
Yeah, I'll jump in, Christina, because I think you did a very nice job summarizing that. And again, I know there's a lot of industry represented. I also know in MSLs we have a variety of diverse backgrounds and understanding of what diversity is. So I think that's the other piece is we got to continue having these discussions, this dialogue, but we also have to come with it with the assumption that not all of us, not all of our peers, not all of our colleagues are on the same playing field that we are, or at the same point in having this conversation that we are. So definitely providing this education and training in background. Again, from a healthcare disparities foundationally, what does that mean? What does unconscious bias mean? What are the barriers and challenges that we're facing? Providing the lexicon for us to go out and have those conversations. Again, we have to have cultural awareness when we go out there. There's cultural awareness and sensitivities when we have a dialogue and conversation, but we need to continue to have those conversations, right? So we can't use that as a reason for not having the conversation. So we need cultural awareness, unconscious bias training, foundational training to go out there and equip ourselves to have those. So when we identify a barrier, we can bring it back. To your point, Christina, we can, as our own CEOs and being entrepreneurial, we can identify within our geography then, provided some guidance of who it is that we need to be identifying. Who are some of those key opinion leaders or thought leaders? And maybe that framework needs to change a little bit so we're more inclusive of key opinion leaders. But who are those, and what kind of conversations could we be having? I loved your discussion also about education in the community setting or in some of the minority settings, because we know that clinical trials are a pathway for high quality medical care. So it's like the tide that rises all boats. So having just that conversation and the pace that the healthcare industry is moving at, having MSLs being part of that discussion of what standard of care, what advances are being made, what's being presented at national congresses, international congresses, those are an opportunity to inform, educate, and bring high quality healthcare to diverse patient populations, not just in clinical trials too. So I love that context, that framework you laid out there. I think as industry representatives in medical affairs, we could be doing more to educate ourselves in being out there and voicing that kind of high quality medical care in clinical trials research for diverse patients.
Yeah.
I love that, Brad. And when I think about Christina's comments around how do you have a comfortable conversation about something that's uncomfortable for many, I think it's important that we acknowledge that it can be uncomfortable. But what I want all our listeners to know is it's really rooted in a concept in D&I called allyship. And allyship encompasses 3 pillars. So one, you can be an ally to one, you can be an ally to some, or you can be an ally to all. So when I think about promoting diversity in clinical trials, I look at it from the 3 pillars through allyship. And it's very important that medical affairs, as we talked about, we're the field facing, we're the ones that healthcare providers see, but we're not just there to be a scientific resource, we're there to be an ally. And it's very important that we demonstrate that ally through our inclusive behaviors. What's also important is that we become very brave when it comes to diversity and inclusion and having those conversations within a corporate lens. We must never forget, even though we're rooted in science and we're in medical affairs, we're still within the context of corporate America. So it's really important that we understand that and bring colleagues along with examples within corporate settings. So what does that look like? So that looks like having diverse opinions, not just in the scientific leaders that you serve, but having diverse opinions on your team, making sure that your hiring practices are in alignment with strategies that bring in diversity of thought, diversity of backgrounds. Also, when we think about medical affairs, advisory boards are a huge area where we can diversify opinions. So is your ad board diverse? Is it ethnically diverse? Is it diverse by background? We know that more people from diverse backgrounds that have a stake at the table is going to lead to robustness of ideas. It's going to enhance our strategies. And we know that diversity, it improves the bottom line. So we have to continue to think about it through this lens. And when I think about being brave about diversity and inclusion, I'm reminded by a really good TED Talk by Melody Hobson called Color Brave. It really sets the tone in what I feel we all should be mindful of. And the way she sets up her TED Talk is in a way that resonates within the corporate lens. And so I encourage everyone, when you're starting the conversation, don't worry about showing up to the conversation with perfection. You should worry about showing up to the conversation with inclusiveness and with a sense of curiosity. It is through that mindset is how you can begin to open yourself up and really appreciate the differences that bind our shared humanity. And I think if we continue to focus on that, it can lead us down some really, really pivotal paths.
That's great, Brian. That's awesome. And I feel like we covered a lot of ground. I feel like we hit on a lot of things. We hit on the clinical trial aspect, but we went past that. We totally went past that. I mean, obviously, there's so much involved in this conversation. So before we finish, I want to give each one of you guys an opportunity to just close out with some final thoughts, whatever it might be, as it relates to this topic and what you want to leave people with. I think that might be just a good way to kind of finish things off. So again, ladies first, we're going to go with you, Christina.
Thank you, Tom. So I did want to say one thing before we close that I think is extremely actionable for field medical teams. One of our currencies is to bring back insights. And, I really encourage teams who are interested in doing this to make it a point to have your ear out for insights. Bringing those insights in, having a team that's dedicated to seeing some of those insights, and really encouraging probing questions for your team to use, like providing those probing questions, actual words can help with the conversations where things are uncomfortable, but providing some of those probing questions that can obviously provide some insight. And I think that, we would get to a better place when we start actually hearing more and more from the field. And I know it'd be appreciated. So that I just wanted to leave that one last thing there. But what do I want to end with? I want to thank everyone. I learned so much, it's just so much insight, so much, you can tell passion, but also just truth in what you're saying. And I'm so happy that we're getting to a point now where we're really having these conversations. I am, I feel like field medical, really honestly, the more that we talk field medical, we have a very valuable role in so many aspects, but specifically we get to be the face of our company. We get to be the face of the goals and objectives and motivations of our company. And, we have the opportunity to be CEOs of our territory and to really help educate and advance clinical practice, advance advance the lives of patients. So this is just one way to be able to do that. And I just really enjoyed this talk and I love it. And I would encourage people to be looking out for more conversations like this, because I know that it's happening. I know that's happening at conferences. I know that's happening elsewhere as well. So yeah, that's what I'll leave it with. Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks, Christina. All right, Brad, final thoughts.
I think Christina summarized it really well. Again, I love the context that Brian used, be brave, in talking about that allies and inclusiveness, and approaching it with curiosity, have those conversations. And then I would leave that there are so many resources out there, so obviously look for your internal resources at your company, but then there's so many resources out there from pharma, our resource organization, looking at the FDA guidance on it. A lot of associations have healthcare disparities and clinical trial diversities as core pillars of their agendas now. And so I think that's really important to be informed and take a look at that. And so I would encourage everyone to be aware of those and think about how, like Christina provided, so many great opportunities or examples to incorporate that into your territory planning and your work and your insights gathering. And then, I'm just going to leave it. Brian gave a great TED quote. I'm going to provide one, and I think it's from Maya Angelou, and I think we all know it, but it's do the best you can until you know better. And then when you know better, do better. And I think, again, there's a lot of great work. We're trying to do better. We're constantly doing better. And we're not there yet. There's lots more work to do. There's a lot of partners to engage on this work in diversity, not just diversity in clinical trials, but healthcare disparities and structural reforms. And so I just encourage everybody to do better.
Thanks, Brad. That's good stuff. All right, Brian, take us home, buddy. You're the last one.
That's why Brad is a guy after my own heart, because I love Maya Angelou. And I'm going to use another Maya Angelou quote that came to mind after Brad said his. And it's not by Maya Angelou, but it's from in early Roman history. It's by Maya Angelou quotes this quote all the time, but it's by a slave named Terence. And he says, "I am a human being. Nothing human can be alien to me." And if we can internalize what that means deeply, what it means is we all share something, and that is our humanity. And diversity and inclusion, it's an opportunity to understand what that humanity looks like from person to person. So Christina said it best in her closing statements. We get to do this. Sometimes when we're inundated in an activity or we're going along our day-to-day, we forget that we have an opportunity. We get to do this, and we can change what doing this looks like. So to Brad's point, we can get better because through curiosity, we can learn where the needs are. To Christina's point, we get to explore. We get to bring those insights back. We get to bring things to people that they never thought of before, they never seen before. And that in and of itself is valuable. So I would like to leave the listeners with, we get to do this. And how wonderful is it that I get to be on this podcast with Christina, Brad, and you, Tom. And thank you so much for this opportunity.
You guys are great, man. This was awesome. I'm going to go back and listen to this again because I feel like I was in it, and there were times when I really kind of feel like I need to hear it again. So I hope everybody feels the same way. I hope everybody enjoys this, but I want to thank you all for coming. Thank you for your insights on such an important topic. And we're going to have to think about what's going to be next. You guys have to come back on. We'll do it again.
We'll do our best.
All
That'd
right,
be
guys.
great, Tom. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you so much for listening to the show. If you've enjoyed it, please subscribe so that you don't miss episodes in the future, and feel free to leave a rating or a review or a comment. Thanks again, and I look forward to seeing you again soon.